So here's the thing. Right. So I've been trying, as for these last few shiurim, I've been trying to figure out the logistics for the Mishkan, for Bayit Rishon, for Bayit Sheni, exactly how the Kohen Gadol got into the Kodesh HaKodeshim and where he went. Where did he put down the Machteh with the Ktoret, and where was he standing when he flicked the blood? So last week we looked at I think we looked at this in Divrei Yamim. We'll look at it also here. I didn't go back over the recording from last week, so I apologize. But let's just take a look at the two parallel sugyot, the two parallel passages, I should say, in Melachim and in Divrei Hayamim, and then I'll show you something from the Sifra on Achrei Mot, and then and then we'll look at the Rambam, even though the Rambam is not as clear in this point as I would have liked, but I think that's going to bring us, at least for the moment, to the end of this discussion, and I'll put out my best. We'll put together our best shot as best as we can, and then when the base of Mikdash is rebuilt, people will figure it out. Fortunately, it won't be up to me. I'm sure that there are other people who have figured it out. It's just I haven't found those sources, and maybe I'm looking too closely into the original sources and not into later sources, but I haven't found. All right, so let's just remind ourselves a little bit about this issue. It says in Shalom, Paul. We actually really.
Okay.
We really
I'm muted. I don't know. No, I'm not muted. Shalom.
We really just started about a minute or two because we were schmoozing. So here we are in Sefer Melachim Aleph, Perek Chet, and let's start here from Pasuk Vav. ויביאו הכהנים את ארון ברית השם אל מקומו, אל דביר הבית, אל קודש הקודשים, אל תחת כנפי הכרובים. Okay, so the Kohanim brought the Aron. They bring the Aron in, as we mentioned earlier, that David had already brought the Aron. The rest of the Mishkan was still in Givon, but then they bring in all the rest of the Mishkan after the Beit HaMikdash is built. So here, this is at the beginning of the Beit HaMikdash of Shlomo, after it's built, so the Kohanim bring the Aron Brit Hashem to its place, El Dvir Habayit, to the Dvir, El Dvir Habayit, El Kodesh HaKodeshim, to the Dvir of the house, which is the wall of the house, to the Kodesh HaKodeshim, El Tachat Kanfei HaKruvim, underneath the wings of the Kruvim. Ki HaKruvim porsim kanafayim al makom ha'aron, because the Kruvim spread their wings to the place of the Aron. Vayasoko HaKruvim al Aron ve'al milamala. So the Kruvim covered over the Aron and its staves from above. Vayarichu habadim vayeru roshei habadim min hakodesh al pnei hadvir v'lo yerau achutza. Okay, so we saw this, and we saw actually. I think we looked at the Gemara on this. But just to remind you, let's look at Rashi. So it says they lengthened the badim. and they were seen, the heads of the Badim were seen from the Kodesh, al Pnei Hadvir, which seems to mean that if you were standing in the Kodesh, you could see them from the side of the Kodesh, from the Heichal, on the face of the Dvir, which is the separation wall, but they were not seen on outside. So outside of what? What weren't they seen outside of?
Presumably the Kodesh.
Well, no. Oh, wait, I'm not sure. Wait a second. You may be answering a slightly different question.
Okay.
What do you mean?
Well, I mean, it says the heads, the staves protruded out beyond the partition.
It doesn't say beyond.
Okay,
And that's
right.
important. It doesn't say beyond. They weren't seen on the outside, meaning you couldn't see them from the Kodesh, that you couldn't see them outside of the Kodesh HaKodeshim. Right? So this is the problem within the pasuk. The pasuk on the one hand it says, "Vayera'u Rashi Abadim min haKodesh al pnei hadvir," that the heads of the badim, the heads of the staves, were seen from the Kodesh. Again, it sounds like you could see them from the Kodesh on the face of the Dvir, on the face of this separation. The lo yera'u achutza, but they weren't seen outside. So the question is, what does that mean? Vayushamad hayom hazeh. So Rashi's perush here is based on the Gemara which I believe I showed you in Yoma, and he says, "Vayeru Roshei Abadim beparochet shekeneged hapetach be'amat traksim," so that the heads of the badim were seen on the parochet shekeneged hapetach, that was essentially on the opening of the dvir. I'll get back. I think we didn't look at the psukim for that. I did prepare them for today. We'll look back at that in a moment. But Amat Traksin, in the Amat Traksin, which is, it's this wall. So exactly what does that mean? Okay, because we learn a little bit elsewhere, learn a little bit earlier, that there is this wall, the dvir, but it has an opening and it has doors. Maybe I should just take a moment and look at that for a second. Back here, Malachim Aleph Perek Vav, it's describing aspects of the building of the Mikdash. We looked at the description of the Kruvim here. After it describes the Kruvim, then it talks about the walls inside and how they were covered and how they were decorated, and the floor, how that was covered with gold. And then it says, "Petach hadvir asad daltot atzei shamen." The opening of the dvir was made from doors of oil wood. Ha'ayil mizuzot chamishit. The ayil it refers to the doorposts. And what it means, chamishit, I think we did look at this once. There are actually a number of different perushim about that, but whatever. There are different perushim to that, we'll just say. But we understand from here that there are doors, presumably two doors, right? It says, Lamed Bet, V'shtei daltot shemen, v'kala otam miklaot, kruvim v'timrot v'turei tzitzim v'tzipa zahav, Vayared al Kruvim Yal Hatimrot et Hazahar. So there's these two doors of Atzei Shemen. The Kala Lehem Miklaot Kruvim, and they were carved into them carvings of the Kruvim and Timrot, like date palms like Tamar, with Turei Tzitzim, and blossoms, the Tzipa Zahab, and they were covered with gold. Okay, so there are these fancy doors. There are these very fancy doors that are in the Dvir, which is also Chazal called the Amat Jaksin. It doesn't say exactly where the doors were. It would seem that
Shel,
yes.
are those the doors between the Kodesh and the Kodesh Kodashim, or are those the entrance doors to the Kodesh? Because I think I understand that between the Kodesh and the Kodesh Kodashim there are no doors. There's a parochet.
No,
it seems strange, no?
No. That's exactly the point. That's exactly the point. There are doors. There are doors that.
Where's the parochet?
So this is good. We didn't do this yet. So let's take time and understand this. So again, here we see in the pasuk that we just did, says that Petach HaDvir, right, the opening to the Dvir, not to the Heichal. So the opening of the Dvir, which is the separation.
The Dvir is the Kodesh HaKodashim, the Dvir, yes.
Right. So the Dvir it really refers to the wall. That's the separation between the Heichal and the Kodesh HaKodashim. And Yasad Daltot Atzei Shamen Ha'ayel Mezuzot Chamishit. Right, and it had this very difficult to describe doorway, but there are these two doors. Ushtei Daltot Atzei Shamen v'Kalal Tamiklaot. And these, they were decorated. They were highly decorated. And see, just to clarify, in Pasuk Hamid Gimel. And similarly, they also made doors for the opening of the Heichal, right? So what we just described was the opening of the Dvir, and then it describes the doors that were on the Heichal, and it describes them also. And those were not made from Atzei. It says the mezuzot were Atzei Shamen. And then it says Ushtei Daltot Atzei Broshim, and then it describes the doors that were the doors to the Heichal, right? That is not as important for us right now. So we do understand that there are these doors. Okay, just a second. Let's look for a moment here at the Radak. He says that Petach HaDvir, right? So this at the opening to the Dvir, he says Kamo Ula Petach HaDvir, right? It's a grammatical thing, right? Petach HaDvir, and the word to the opening of the V'chein Asad Damo Kamo Lidamo, right? So he's just explaining why it says Ve'et. It means the same thing as if it would have said Ula Petach HaDvir. And then he gives his perush about exactly what that means. Not as important for us right now. Ushtei daltot atzei shamen. Ushtei daltot atzei shamen shamar shasa lefetach hadvir kala alehem miklaot kruvim kamo shasa lekirot. And he's just saying that's how you understand the pasuk. It says that these doors were, excuse me, they had these carvings of the kruvim and the timrot and the pturei, the tzitzim, etc., similar to the way they had done these designs, which we looked at another time. They did similar designs on the walls. Okay, this is also a little bit more of a grammatical issue. So this is how the Radak understands it, right? Because it mentions 2 times that there are doors, right? It says, "Ve'petach hadvir asad daltot atzei shamen," And then the next pasuk it says, "Ushtei daltot atzei shemen." So the way the Radak understands this is that there are two sets of doors. There's like two doors, and then another two doors. So this tells you, when it mentions the second time, that tells you that there were four doors. Similarly to the opening of the Hechal. And in terms of the opening of the Hechal, we saw that a long time ago. We haven't gone through all of Masechet Midot by any stretch. But we did learn this back when we were learning Masechet Tamid, that between the Ulam and the Hechal, there were two sets of doors. There were, like, you walked into the Ulam, that you're in the Azara, you walk up the stairs, you go into the Ulam, and in the Ulam, you walk a few amot, and then there's a set of doors. If you were to open them, then there would be another set of doors. The way they did it in the morning is the Kohen would go in through the side into the Hechal and open up the doors in the Hechal first, and then open up the other doors. And if you remember, there are different opinions about that, but one opinion is that the doors of the Hechal, standing inside of the Hechal, they opened outwards and covered half of the wall between the Hechal and the opening of the Ulam. And then when you opened the doors of the Ulam, they would go inwards and cover the other half of the wall, right? So that when you walked in, it was completely, you didn't see the wall, you just saw the doors. Right? In Yechezkel, it's in his description of his vision of the Beit HaMikdash, it's more clear, right, that there are two sets of doors. Pirshu Razal, החיצונות נפתחות לתוך הפתח לכסות עוביו של הכותל, והפנימית נפתחות, it should be הפנימיות, I guess, נפתחות לתוך הבית, לכסות אחר הדלתות, שכל הבית היה תוח בזהב, חוץ מאחורי הדלתות. He's describing now what I just described to you. It's the wall that's in between the Ulam and the Hechal was the only part of the Beit HaMikdash that was not covered in gold. But when you opened the doors, which were covered with gold, they would cover the walls, and when you walked in, it would be completely covered with gold. So here he says, even though there were doors to the opening of the Dvir, there was also a parochet, which we'll look at in a minute. This is described in Divrei Hayamim, Yot Masach Lepetach, right, to be a covering to the opening. The fish lo hayu dlatot nisgarot. These doors were not closed. Sharei badei aron netunim al pnei hadvir. Because we see from the pasuk here that the tips of the badim were placed on the face of the dvir. That means they had to come right up to the dvir, up to the wall. Imken haparochet haya masach l'shar hadvir. So it means then that the parochet was a covering to this gate or this opening into the dvir. So this is
so the doors were open all the time. Maybe they were just
like
they were open and they were covering the wall on both sides. Something that they were very close to the wall, to the dvir.
Right. So this is the way I understand it. So we're talking. First, I explained this idea that there were two sets of doors coming from the Ulam into the Hechal, right? So if those doors are open, the Ulam doors open inside, and the Hechal doors open outside. So when you walk in from the Ulam to the Hechal, what you see on each side are the open doors. Right? Then you would walk, if you would walk up now to the Dvir, so what you would see is a set of doors apparently that are open all the way, and they're open and covering, they're just against the Dvir. They were open all the way, 180 degrees, and they cover the opening of the Dvir. Presumably also inside, right? Because we understand now there are two sets of doors on the Dvir. So one set of doors would be open inside into the Heichal. You would see them in the Heichal. And then on the Kodesh HaKodeshim side, there would be another set of doors that would also be open, that would be against the wall of the Dvir inside of the Kodesh HaKodeshim.
But then you are unable to close them, and because you have got
Yes.
this the Aron and the Kaporet and the
Right.
Kruvim, and
They're
you just can't
there.
close them. There's no place to, no room
There's no
to place them.
Right. There's no place to close them. Once they're open, in other words, it's not clear why they're there, but they are there, right? So there are doors both on the inside and the outside that are always open. And then what separates your vision, right, from the Hechal into the Kodesh HaKodeshim is a parochet. There's a parochet hanging in the width of the, presumably in the width of the Dvir, of the Amat Raksin.
This means that the doors are in effect a decoration. It's just to decorate the Dvir on both sides. On both sides.
Right. Apparently. In other words, aside from any other deeper meaning that we might understand about having doors, but for the casual observer, they're just decorative because nobody actually closes them, which is unlike the doors of the Ulam and the Heichal, which actually do get closed and locked every night, as we learned, right? Because the Kohanim have to go in the morning and open them. But the Kodesh HaKodeshim, the doors are always open, but there are these two sets of doors. Let's just take a second and look at.
A really quick question: Is this combination of door and parochet, or at least one set of doors and parochet, where we get the architecture of an Arona, of the Arona Kodesh and Beit Knesset?
Do you know what? I'm not sure, but we call the covering to the Aron, we call it a parochet, right? And it's obviously based on this idea. It's based on the idea that there was of the original parochet of the Mishkan. So in the Mishkan, the only separation between the Kodesh and the Kodesh HaKodeshim was a parochet, and what was behind the parochet was the Aron, which is the Torah, right? Whether Pshuto Shel Inyan, which is that the Aron had just the Luchot, or according to Chazal, they had the Luchot, the Shivrei Luchot, and the Sefer Torah. But the idea is that the Kodesh HaKodeshim is the place of the Torah. And nowadays, since we don't have a real Kodesh HaKodeshim, the Aron, as it were, stands in place of the Kodesh HaKodeshim, and we cover it with a parochet. So, yeah, Yesh Lomar. Yesh Lomar. Let's look for a second now at the psukim in Divrei Hayamim. Just a second. Where is it? Here describe no. I should have cut and pasted these onto a single page. Hold on a second. We saw this again also here. It talks about the Kruvim. Here in Pasuk Yudad, this is Divrei Yamin Bet Perek Gimel. Vayas et aparochet tcheret ve'agaman b'charmil uvutz. So the parochet was made from the same materials as it's described in the Torah. Tcheret, agaman, carmil is understood to be the tolat shani, the crimson that's mentioned in the Torah. Vayal love.
Or what we would call carmine, which I would guess maybe a cognate.
It seems it could be that it's related. I was looking at the dictionary. There could be a not just a casual, coincidental relationship, but carmil might be related to the word carmen.
Carmine is made from bugs, tiny little bugs.
Yeah, so that's tolat shani also. Vayasif ne'abayit amudim shnaim. Okay, so those are the amudim. I apologize because I had this. Thought I had that open to the right place. This is skipping ahead. This is in Parakeh. This is the parallel to where we started in Malachim Aleph. But I'm sorry. Hold on one second. I wanted to see this. I don't know why I can't find this now. My eyes are not seeing it. No. All right. I can't see it. Oh no. Maybe I'm confusing myself. Okay. But here in the description of the parochet, this is in Perek Gimel, Vayaset parochet chayil v'agaman v'charmil uvutz, Vayal alav kruvim, and they put on them kruvim. In other words, there were kruvim that were worked into the pattern of the parochet. So here the Radak says, Vayaset parochet asa parochet afal pisha yu dvir delatot. Even though the dvir had doors. Lo lefisha lo hayu niskarot kedei yera'u abadim al pnei hadvir. So they were these doors. So I'm confusing myself. The doors are not mentioned specifically here, the way they're mentioned specifically in what I showed you in Malachim Aleph. But the parochet is mentioned. So here the parochet is mentioned, and the Radak explains, even though there were doors to the dvir, as we saw in Malachim Aleph, but those doors were never closed, in order that you could see the badim al pnei hadvir. You could see the staves on the face of the dvir. Okay, that is what I was looking for. And now let's skip ahead to Parakeh in Divrei Hayamim. And so here also it talks about Pasukei. It says, Vayelu et Aaron. They brought the Aaron and the Ohel Moed. The Ohel Moed was the old Mishkan. V'et kol klei HaKodesh asher be'ohel ha'elu otam ha'kohanim ha'leviyim. By the way, Michael Werner, you'll be happy to know I took a COVID test and it was negative. והמלך שלמה וכל עדת ישראל הנועדים עליו לפני הארון, מזבחים צאן ובקר שלא יספרו ויאמנו מרוב. So they brought a lot of korbanot, ויביאו הכהנים את ארון ברית השם אל מקומו, אל דביר הבית, אל קודש הקודשים, אל תחת כנפי הכרובים. Right, so the Kohanim, right, this is the parallel to what we saw in Melachim. They bring the Aron to its place, to the Dvir, to the Kodesh HaKodeshim, under the wings of the Kruvim. Vayu HaKruvim porsim Yafayim HaMakom HaAron, Vayichasu HaKruvim Al-Ha'aron V'Al-Badav Milamala, similar, almost verbatim to what we saw in Melachim. And it says here also, Vayarichu Abadim, Vayera'u Roshei Abadim min ha'aron al pnei hadvir, v'lo yera'u achutza, vayisham ad hayom hazeh. Right, so this is parallel to the pasuk we saw in Melachim. So here the Radak says a little bit more. He says, Vayarichu Abadim. He says, Im elu Abadim heim shayu ba'aron mitchila. So if these were the original Badim that were on the Aron, Tamahu or Tamuahu, right? It's wondrous. How would you see them on the face of the Dvir? We know for sure, right? So once again, Torah doesn't tell us how long the Badim were. We have the dimensions for the Aron, but we don't have the dimensions for the Badim. But the Radak reasonably says they could not have been longer than 10 amot. How do I know? We know that the inside of the Kodesh HaKodeshim of the Mishkan was 10 by 10. The Aron was put inside of the Kodesh HaKodeshim. In the Torah, it doesn't say that you could see the Badim outside of the Parochet. So it means that at most, the Badim would have been 10 amot. That would have been the maximum length they could have been to go from the western wall, the back wall, up to the Parochet. Madvir, by contrast, Hayarach bo esrim, it was 20. It was 20 by 20. How could the tips of the Badim be seen on the face of the Dvir? V'afshar shasu aron Badim acherim arukim mehem k'dei sheyirau pnei hadvir. So one possibility is that they made other Badim that were longer, so that they could be seen all the way up to the face of the Dvir.
But they say that they pulled them out. They were pulled out, not all the way, but
well, that we're getting
a certain distance.
So that's the other pshat. But he's giving, in other words, it's not clear. So one pshat is though that they actually lengthened the length of the badim. Efshar shasu eron badim acherim arukim mehem k'dei sheyirau pnei hadvir. V'zehu sheomer vaya'arichu Shuhu poel yotzei, right? That they lengthened. It's a transitive verb. Means they had to do something to the badim to make them longer. V'lo amar vaya'archu, that they were passively longer, that they were somehow just longer. Gamken. Now we'll get to the other one. Gamken yitachen lefaresh ki otan habadim hayu shehayu ba'aron mitchila. So the other part, so by the way, here when the Radak says this, he says, it's not clear to me also what he means. Does he mean, when he says Vayarichu, does he mean that they made altogether different Badim that were longer? Or does he mean, and I think maybe this is what he means, that they added extensions onto the Badim? Because we learned that Pshuto Shel Inyan, that the Badim were never supposed to be removed from the Tabaot, right? So Imken, even though Shlomo made other additions to the Beit HaMikdash that were not in the Mishkan. He added these other kruvim, he added shulchanot, he added menorot, he added the Yam Shel Shlomo, he added all these things, but he didn't take away from things that were. He didn't take away from anything that was. So I think maybe this is what he means by Arichu, Shu Poel Yotzei. That means that they lengthened the existing badim. They added on to them, right? It could be, like I said, that maybe the badim were 10 amot. Before they brought the Aron into the Dvir, maybe they were placed equally, in other words, so that the midpoint of the badim was at the midpoint halfway through the width of the Aron, right? And so from the middle of the Aron outwards to each side, it would be sticking out 5 amot. And since the width of the Aron was 1.5 amot, so you can do the math, right? So it would be 5 minus 3 3/4. It would be sticking beyond, it would stick out beyond the Aron itself 4.25 amot in each direction, right? Because you'd have the width is 1.5, and then 10, right? You have to get to 10. Anyway, I hope that yes, go ahead. Go ahead.
I sent you to WhatsApp a picture of a small replica of the temple, which was found in the excavations in Haifa. And there you see how the doors of the temple were made. They were made of many frames, one inside the other.
So this is, here, one second. Let me make sure everybody can see this. Yeah, you can see this. So this is actually interesting, because this is one of the pshatim. When it said, we saw before, it says ha'ayil mezuzot chamishit, right? There's an idea that the door frame had 5. Here, it depends how you count, but the idea was that the door frame had 5.
Shane, this is the entrance of the temple. There were 3 frames. 1, 2, 3.
No, I understand.
But inside there are 5.
Oh, inside what?
Between the Kodesh and the Kodashim, they have 5 frames. They have 3 at the entrance, and then 4, and then 5.
Right. So, and okay. So, just again, remind me. So, where is this from?
This is. I sent you the article, which comes from Makor Rishon to your mail, but this comes from an excavation in Haifa, which is in the Emek HaElah, where they found a temple from the period where there was, before the Ichud HaPulchan, but inside this excavation, they found a small temple, a replica of a temple, which they assumed that this was the temple in Jerusalem. But they're not sure, but it probably looks like this, something like this. Yes.
Something like this. Right. So this is so I didn't dwell on that earlier, but yeah, when it says that the doorways of the ayil mezuzot chamishit,
yes.
Right. So that's one of there are several different pshatim, but one of them is like this. It's this idea that you would have like continual frames, like frame within a frame within a frame 5 times, and you're saying that is in fact what they found in this.
In Haifa, yes. Mm-hmm.
That's fascinating.
They did find a temple in Haifa, which was closed up. They understood that from starting at a certain period, the temple wasn't used anymore. But it's probably from the period before there was a single temple in Jerusalem.
And then, so yesh lomar shezeh dugma, right? That this was in that. So that supports that pshat, which is quite interesting. Hold on, let me go back. Okay, so he says Gam Yitachen Farish, right? So then I think we saw this trouble. Let's just go through it again. It could be that the Badim were in fact Eser Amot. V'kolam shichnisu ha'aron ledvir ayu Badim netunim ba'aron b'shaveh. Right. So originally the Badim were put in evenly. They stuck out evenly on each side. Shayu adfim acharei ha'aron k'mo lifnei Aaron. They stuck out as much from the back as they did in front. Because for practical reasons, that would have made sense because you had to have 4 people carrying it. So you had 2 badim in back and 2 badim in front. The whole bad shnei anashim. For each stave there were 2 people. Echad lefanav, echad la'achorav. They brought the aron to the dvir as it was. Im badav, with the staves, since it was not an expectation that it would need to be carried again on the shoulders of the Kohanim. Herichu abadim umashchum klape chutz. Herichu meaning, like Paul was saying a moment ago, they were pulled out. In other words, that you were able to move them back and forth, and now they were pulled out toward the front. So it means if they were 10 amot long. So what I think part of the issue here is there's this idea that the Aron would have been placed, as we discussed before, in the very center of the Kodesh HaKodeshim. Ben b'mishkan, ben b'bayit rishon, ben b'bayit sheni, except b'bayit sheni didn't have one. But wherever you have a Beit HaMikdash, in the Kodesh HaKodeshim, the place of the Aron would have been the very center. And so what happens to the Badim? So if you want the Badim to come all the way up to the Dvir, then you could place the Aron. Now here's the thing. If you place the Aron dead center, it would still not make it all the way up to the Dvir, right? If the Badim are 10, right? Because the first 1.5 amot is still going to be the width of the Aron, right? Remember, the Aron is the length of the Aron is parallel to the western and eastern walls. The width is parallel to the north and south walls, and the Badim are on the width side, right? We discussed this before, which may be a little counterintuitive, but that's the way it's described. So it means then that you would have 8.5 amot if you pull the badim all the way to the end, all right, so that the end of the badim that are closest to the western wall get pulled all the way up to as far as you could go and still be within the tabaot. So then you have, from there, you have 1.5 amot, which is the width of the aron, and you have another 8.5 amot. So in order to get the badim to actually touch the parochet, you would have to actually move the aron up by another 1.5. You'd have to move it eastward, another 1.5. But let's just see the way the Radak explains it. He says, since it was not going to be carried in the future, עד שנראו ראשי הבדים על פני הדביר, כדי שיהיה נכנס שם כהן גדול ביום הכיפורים, להקטיר בין הבדים, ולא יהיה פונה הנה והנה. So we saw this, I think, last time, and it's not 100% clear to me exactly what he means here, right? He says that the front, right, the tips of the badim are going to be al pnei hadvir. They're going to be all the way up to the parochet on the dvir, in order that when the Kohen Gadol goes in there on Yom Kippur to be maktir, between the badim, lo yeponeh heina v'heina. You won't have to turn this way or that way. So what does he mean? So the way, I think the way we understood it last time is that he would walk in, like he would open the parochet and walk in, and then he would immediately be between the two badim. And then it sounds like that's where he would put down the ktoret. But here's a problem. It doesn't seem like that's possible. It could, and I'll show you why. I'll show you why from the Sifra in a moment. Let's just finish the Radak here. It says, you couldn't see them outside of the face of the Dvir. V'im tomar, kevan shelo haya orech habadim ela eser amot. Since the length of the badim was only 10 amot, v'advir rachbo esrim, the Dvir was 20. How could you see them on the face of the Dvir? Yitachem shelo natnu ha'aron samuch l'kotel ma'aravi el hirchiko to min ha'kota. In other words, pursuant to what I just explained a moment ago, when he says it could be that they didn't put the Aron close to the Kotel Maravi, but he means what the implication is that they would have removed it further away from the Kotel Maravi in order to bring the staves closer to the parochet. In other words, as I explained a moment ago, it would have had if it were true, if all of this were true, that the badim were only 10 amot long at the most, then the Aron could not have been dead center in the middle of the Kodesh HaKodeshim. But there's a lot of ifs here, right? Because the other possibility he already said, maybe they simply added on to the length of the badim. But either way, we do now have this image. We have these badim that are touching the parochet, and they're poking at it a little bit, so that if you're standing in the heichal, you can see where the protrusions that are made from the badim against the parochet, like the Gemara described, kishnei dadei isha, right, like the nipples of a woman. And then there's no description here of how you open the parochet. Now, when we talk about it in Bayit Sheni, so we understand there are two parochot, and on the south side of the outer parochet, the one in the Heichal, it's prufa. It's like folded back, and then the Kohen goes through and he walks between the two parochot, and he enters through the north side, which is also prufa. Here, the parochet is in the middle. It doesn't even have to cover the entire wall, which is good because it's much bigger. But and we don't know the dimensions, right? We didn't see the dimensions for the doors, right? This opening in the Dvir, it just says there's an opening in the Dvir, and there's two sets of doors, and these doors are always open, but we don't know how big it is. Okay, so we know it must be at least 2.5 amot wide. It has to be a little bit more than that in order for them to get the Aron in, right? Because the Aron, that's the only way you would be able to get it in. The whole width of the Dvir was 20. So it takes up some amount of space, and presumably, this opening is in the middle of the Dvir. So however you open the parochet, so the question is, or I shouldn't say it like, I would ask it as a question. So when the parochet is open, so let's say the Kohen Gadol is walking now toward from the Heichal into the Kodesh HaKodeshim. He comes up to the parochet. So let's say the parochet, it has to be wider than the width of the Aron with the badim, right? because we can see the protrusions of the badim. It has to be wider than that. So presumably, and also we have no indication that the parochet was anything except a single parochet. It wasn't like two parochot that you would open in the middle. So presumably he's going to go in on one side or the other. He would have to pull back the parochet and walk. So maybe this is what he means when he says, when he said before, still not clear exactly what he means, but it could be what he means is that he would open the parochet. He wouldn't go in between the badim that are sticking out al penei hadvir. He would open the parochet. He would go out and around to the back of the aron. And the reason I'm going to tell you that is because that's the way Chazal understood that we'll see. I'll show you in the Sifra. That's the way Chazal understood that had to be the position of the Kohen Gadol. He had to be facing east, right? So otherwise he would have his back to he can't have his back to the Aron, right? We saw there's a hakpada. He doesn't ever put his back to the Aron. So why do I say he's going to face east? Here, I'll show you in the okay, so here's the pasuk way back in Achremot. Let's just remind ourselves from here. V'lakach melo hamachta gachalei esh. So the Kohen Gadol takes a coal pan that's full of coals, be'al hamizbeach, right, with coals that came from the mizbeach mifnei Hashem. He took his hands full of Ketoret Samim, which we learned about in the Mishnah, that he would measure it out with his handfuls and put it into a kaf. That he would bring that inside of the parochet, meaning into the Kodesh HaKodeshim. That's inside of the parochet. Right, so he puts the Ketoret onto the fire, and then that makes a cloud of incense, and that's the first thing he needs to do when he comes in. Then it says v'lakach midam apar, so it doesn't tell us exactly where he puts down the machta, but we'll come back to that in a second. V'lakach midam apar v'hizabetz ba'ol al penei hakaporet kedma. So he takes from the blood of the par and he sprinkles it with his finger on the face of the kaporet eastward. Lifnei kaporet, in front of the kaporet, he sprinkles 7 times from the blood with his finger. Right. So we know this. He does 1, and then he does 7. So here the Sifra says on this pasuk, v'lakach midam apar. Okay, actually we don't have to do that. The next one, al penei hakaporet. Al penei hakaporet, kedma, ze binyan av. This is a binyan av. I'll explain a binyan av in a second. Kol makom shenamar kaporet, ze hapanim lemizrach. Anytime when it mentions the kaporet, means that you have to be facing eastward, right? So the Torah itself says b'nei kaporet kedma. So it's a binyan av that any. If you're familiar with the term binyan av, right? So binyan av, it's one of the midot hadrash in the famous right of Tanu de Rabbi Yishmael that's in the Sidur, a binyan av is an archetype. It's an archetype that we're going to that we see a pasuk or a phrase in a pasuk or a word in a pasuk that's going to define for us for the entire Torah what something means, or it's going to give it. It'll give us a definition that we're going to use throughout, and so that's what it is here also. So we understand from here, from the Sifra, that the Kohen Gadol, also from Pshutosha Mikra, but also Od Yoter, or Lo Pachot, Sifra, that the Kohen Gadol had to be facing east when he does this avodah. So if that's true, so now let's think about it. If he was when he was in the Mishkan, so let's think. He had to go from the Heichal into the Kodesh HaKodeshim. Again, it doesn't tell us exactly how he went through the parochet, but we know it was a one parochet. It didn't open in the middle, and so he must have gone in on either the north side or the south side. And there's reasons to say that he went on the north side. So it must have been that he just pulled back the curtain and walked in. And
so he turned around. He probably entered at one side, let's say it's the north, stood on the other side of the Aron, turned back towards the Aron, and when he went out, probably did the whole circle again, and left at the south, something like this, like we do today with the Sefer Torah. We also do אנחנו מקיפים את הבימה.
Yeah, so that's all possible. In other words, here, when we learned this in the you know what? I'll come back to that in a second. Let's imagine though for a moment. A moment ago, the Radak put forth the possibility that the Badim were 10 amot long. If they're actually 10 amot long, it's a problem.
He can't turn around. There's no way.
Well, he would have to duck. Whether he turns around or let's say Bonagid, he walks in, let's say on the north side, and then let's say he walks along facing west, right? He's going from facing south. He's going from north to south, and then he comes to the Bad, right? There's a Bad there, because according to the way the Radak said, now the Radak didn't claim this is absolutely certain, but what the Radak's claim was the Badim could not have been longer than 10. They couldn't have been more than 10, because if they had been 10, that would have taken up the entire space of the in the Mishkan, right, where it was only 10 by 10. So let's say Bonagid let's think for a moment. Let's say there were 10, which means the Badim go from the western wall, the far wall, all the way up to the Parochet. And we just learned that he has to go, when he does apparently all of the avodot that he's going to do, al Pnei HaKaporet, he has to be facing east. So let's say he comes in the north, he faces south, he gets to the Bad, so then he'll face west. But how does he get in between the Badim? He would have to duck under. So there's an argument to say, because that I didn't see anyone say this anywhere, and that's no proof, because I'm not expert enough to tell you that nobody did. It's possibly an argument to say, though, that the Badim were not in fact 10 amot long, that they were less. Maybe they were only 8 long, and he had an amma so that he could go all the way to the western wall and then place himself. But he has to get in between the Badim.
Don't forget that it's completely, יש חושך מוחלט שם בפנים. So it doesn't see anything.
Now that's a question if it was choshech muchlat. But let's remember also he has a lifachot. If we want to go with just a piteva, he's holding glowing coals. So he has some amount of light, right? And we know our eyes, Baruch Hashem, we adjust to such conditions. But that's still it's still a good point when we're trying to recreate in our minds what was the reality. So yeah, it wasn't, as far as we know, it wasn't all lit up, right? So presumably, let's say that this is how it happened. I don't know, but this is, I think, a reasonable way of understanding it. That he came in from the north, maybe he walked along the Parochet. Why do I say he walked along the Parochet facing south? Because that's the way it's described in the Mishnah that he did in Beit Sheni. And then he would have gone the length of the Badim toward the west, and then either he would have had to duck under the Bad, or maybe there was enough room, right, that the Badim didn't really reach all the way back to the western wall, and then he would place himself at that place in front of the Aron. He would put down the Machta, and then he would put on the Ktoret. How he did the Ktoret is very tricky, and I don't think we're going to get into it tonight. We mentioned it a long time ago when we were looking at the Mishnah, but that's a bit of a separate issue. Now let's think about what he did in Beit Shel Shlomo. So in Beit Shel Shlomo, it's a different reality, but it could be that he comes up to the Parochet, which is in the middle of the Amatraksim, and he pushes aside the Parochet and comes in, let's say, from the north. And at this point, he's either right next to or very close to the edge of the Bad. So maybe he just goes straight back and then places himself between the Badim that are protruding, whatever is protruding from behind. And then it would be the same as what he did in the Mishkan. And then when we come to Beit Sheni, there is no Aron. So there is no Aron, there's no Badim. We only have the Even Shtiyah. And the Even Shtiyah was in the place of the Aron. And so he would go in there. Just a second. Mishnah, Yoma. Let's just remind ourselves the way the Mishnah described it. Right, so this is Yoma Appendix Mishnah Aleph. הוציאו לו את הכף ואת המחתה וכיפן לו חפניו ונתן לתוך הכף הגדול לתוך הכף הגדול לפי גדלו, קטן לפי קטנו, וכך הייתה מידתה. נטל את המחתה בימינו, he took the מחתה with the coals in his right hand ואת הכף בשמאלו, the כף with the Ktoret in his left hand, היה מהלך בהיכל עד שמגיע לבין שתי הפרוחות המבדילות בין הקודש ובין קודש הקודשים, ובהם אמה. Right, so he comes now to the south side, and he's going to enter in between the two parochot. Rabbi Yossi says, no, there was only one parochet, etc. We come back now though to the Tanakh. Ben HaKodesh ben Kodesh HaKodeshim HaChitzona Ita Prufa Min HaDarom. It was like folded back from the south. V'Pnimit Min HaTzafon. The inner parochet was folded back from the north. Malech Beinehem Ad Shemagia LeTzafon Hagia LeTzafon Ofech Panav LeDarom. So when he entered in from the north side into the Kodesh HaKodeshim, he turns his face southward. He goes with his left to the parochet, right? So he's facing south, so his left side is near or neck or parallel to the parochet. Achu magia la'aron, until he comes to the aron. הגיע לארון נותן את המחתה בין שני הבדים. Okay, so now it's interesting to consider the language of the Mishnah, right? Because the Mishnah here is describing the way the Mishnah seems to think this took place. There's like an irbuvia here, right? Because it's talking about Bayit Sheni, where there is no Aron. But it's describing, and it's also describing the reality of Bayit Sheni, where there are two parochot. But then it describes what he did when he came to the Aron. But there was no Aron in Bayit Sheni. So the point, this description of what he does when he comes to the Aron must be a description of what took place in Bayit Rishon, or also in the Mishkan, right? But what it doesn't tell us then is all the things that we've been trying to figure out, which is exactly how did he get into the Mishkan? In the Mishkan, how did he get into the Kodesh HaKodeshim? In Bayit Rishon, how did he get into the Kodesh HaKodeshim? Here it tells us, we know exactly in Bayit Sheni how he got into the Kodesh HaKodeshim. And so it seems to be like it's telling us, but however he got into the Kodesh HaKodeshim in the Mishkan and Bayit Rishon, once he got up to the Aron, then this is what he would do. He places the machta between the two badim. So the two badim, where? On the eastern side or on the western side? So what I just put forth is that it seems like he would have gone to the western side, although not necessarily. Maybe he dafka puts the machta on the eastern side, and then when he comes back with the blood, he's not right next to where the cloud is coming out of the machta. But he put the Ketorah on the k'chim, nitmalei kol habayit kulo ashan, etc. I think just to finish off for today, let's just look at the Rambam's summary. No, not there. Oof. Here it is. Okay, so the Rambam in Parak Revi'i of Hilchot Avodat Yom Kippurim, he does a summary. He goes into a lot of details in the first three chapters about the different avodot, and here he's just putting it together in one continual list of things that the Kohen Gadol did. So this is the way he describes it. We already explained elsewhere that taking a kli sharet that would hold blood from a korban in one's left hand is pasul, that poselet b'dam kodeshim, and it's also pasul for other services that were done in the Beit HaMikdash. Therefore, you should argue that minadin, right, by all rights, he should have put the kol pan in his left hand, the kaf haktoret b'yamina, because you should put the ktoret in his right hand as he's coming in, because the avodah is really the ktoret and not the kols. But because the machta, the kol pan was very heavy, and also because it was hot, and he wouldn't be able to carry it in his left hand all the way up to the aron, therefore he takes the machta in his right hand and the kaf haktoret in his left hand. He goes in the hechal until he gets up to the Kodesh HaKodeshim. So here he doesn't go into the details of going in from the south and then in the north, he says he finds the parochet is folded back. He goes into the Kodesh HaKodeshim until he gets to the Aron. Gia la'Aron notenet ha'machta ben shnei abadim. Basically, just quoting the mission that we just saw. He puts the machta between the two staves. B'bayit sheni shelo haya Aron haya menicha al even hashtiya. He would put it on the even shtiya. Then it describes how he would put the ketoret onto the coals, because he has to put the ketoret on the coals from his hands. But the ketoret right now is in a kaf, and he had pre-measured using his own hands the amount of the ketoret that's in the kaf. So then he says, he would hold the tip of the edge of the kaf with the tips of his fingers or with his teeth, which actually makes more sense. Because he has to push the ketoret with his thumb into his palms, into his hands, until he returns them to be the fullness of his two fists as they were when he measured it. This was a difficult avodah in the mikdash. It's actually a machloket in the Gemara, but this is the way the Rambam says. Anyway, I think that's going to be it for now for this discussion. We spent a lot of time on this, but we learned a lot of interesting things along the way. And even though I don't think we came to a clear final, at least not in my mind, it's not 100% clear to me all of these details, but at least we have some idea of possibilities of how each of these scenarios in Mishkan, Bayit Rishon, and Bayit Sheni would have played out.
The Rambam is describing a jungler.
Yeah. Well, not juggling exactly, but I was trying to think what he meant. He says either, right, this is from the Gemara, either Broshei Atzbotav or B'shinav. So if he puts it in his mouth, I understand, because then he can hold it in his mouth, and then he can take like one hand and push half of the Torah into one hand, and then he'll take his other hand and push the other half into his other hand. Kacha. And then Echshu Morid et Kaf. Oh, lo tzarich. At that moment, then he can put the Ktoret onto the Gachalin, onto the coals. And then the clouds come. And then at that point, he can take the kaf out of his mouth. But if he does it like the Rambam, like the Gemara, and the Rambam says, Broshei Atzbotav, that would be really hard, because I was trying to think about this. So maybe he holds the kaf. He has to hold the kaf in his right. At that point, he does have to hold the kaf in his right hand, right? Because once he puts down the machta, he has no excuse to hold it in his left hand. So he has to hold it in his right hand, and that's what he means by he takes his thumb. He would take his thumb and push out the half of the Torah into his left hand. Lo nagid. Now, how does he get the rest of it into the right hand? Because he can't use Roshei Etzbotav anymore to hold the kaf, right? Because that chofen is now closed. The fist is closed. He can't open it until he opens it on top of the. So maybe maybe he does the first hand like that. He holds the kaf Roshei Etzbotav and pushes it out with his thumb, and then he transfers it to his teeth. And then he does like that. But Zohi Avodah Kasha Shebimikdash. So this was something that the Gemara says. This was a hard, difficult service that was done in the Mikdash, and the implication is that it was among the most difficult things that a Kohen could learn how to do in the Mikdash. So it was very tricky. Anyway, okay.
Now you understand why we are singing Ma Yafe Mare Kohen Gadol. I don't remember exactly. So, when he succeeded to do all this complicated things.
No, זה לא פשוט. And also, just remember you know, so the Torah was extremely difficult, but all of the avodah was difficult. I know from I've never learned shechita up close and personal, but I know if you have to shecht a bull, you have to be very strong to do that. It's a lo pashut. These are all very difficult things to do. Shechting a smaller animal is not as hard. It's also difficult, but to shecht a bull, you need to. I knew a shochet once. He was shorter than me, but he was built like a bull. He was like this very short. He was a short but very stout, very powerful man, and he shechted steer. He shechted camels and bulls.
Now you understand why you have to retire at 50.
Yesh lomar, right? Because that the Torah, right? The Chazal understood it means like once you pass 50, you're past the peak of your strength. That's it. Anyway, I'm going to think about what we're going to do next. I thought the next thing we do, we had looked, I think, a little bit at the Mishnah in Menachot. I'm going to try to prepare next time sheets with some other information about the layout of the Beit HaMikdash with not just the Mishkan, but in the Beit HaMikdash, we know from the Beit HaMikdash of Shlomo that he added in 10 shulchanot and 10 menorot, and how exactly was the layout done? Where was everything standing? And we'll go into that somewhat. But the other thing that we have outstanding, which we said we would get back to, is this question of exactly how the menorah, the hatavata menorah in the morning and bein ha'arbayim, and the differences and the similarities between the two, and also the different, the machloket, based on the machloket of the position of the menorah. Was the menorah going from east to west, or was it going north to south? Right? The way we learned it in Masachet Tamid, it was going east to west. But we know there's also a dayah that it went north to south. And how did that work? And what were all, and also how did the Kohanim walk, like where were all these shulchanot and menorot? Where exactly were they that people could walk in and get around them? So I think I'll prepare some of that for next time. And then I think maybe there's one other inyan that I want to cover, and then we're going to start into Perek Shmini and start to learn Hilchot Yom Kippurim for our practical reasons. But I think that's it for tonight. Tov, that actually went better than I thought. Any last questions, comments? No, say them. So, as Laila Tov, see you next week.
יישר כוח, יישר כוח.
Baruch Tzia. Bye-bye. Oh, and thank you for that picture. Kol tov.